All right, now I can speak.
Yeah, hopefully you're all back from break. Andrew Tran, you got a question, comment for us?
Yeah, I have a question about workflow actually. So the way we're doing it right now, we're doing like the Django REST API, but we already know that we're going to combine it into a full stack application. Would you already start writing the backend? Like if you were doing this like for your own personal self, would you already start writing the backend to like take into account like the API views and doing all those changes like right now?
Could you elaborate? What changes are you referring to?
Because when we like combine our React and Django to work together, like we have to switch our Django views to like we have to put that like at API view tag on like top of them, right? Just like small things like that.
So two things. So the view sets kind of automatically handle the API view functionality. So if you remember, I think Raphael had like a decorator he was using called API view. That's baked into view sets. So we do not know how to do that. Additionally, I'm going to do things a little differently today, both for speed and for showing a kind of different approach. But I'm not going to be combining my front end and back end directly, as in I'm not going to nest the React inside of the Django. Both achieve essentially the same thing. There are a few differences. We'll talk about those. But I just want to, in the interest of time, kind of keeping them separate. So I have that hot reloading and other things that I like. I'm just going to keep them separate.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Cool. So let me share my screen here and we'll dive into it. So we accomplished a lot in 1 hour. We accomplished our backend or preliminary backend. Again, there might be some changes we need to make, but now we're going to move on to the more fun part, in my opinion, is developing the front end, because I enjoy working with React. Hopefully some of you guys are with me in that camp, but if not, Django will come back into the mix, I assure you. All right, so I'm going to create a new terminal. I'm going to call clear this. I actually don't need to be in my virtual environment, but I don't think it's going to matter. But in this case, I'm going to do npx create React app, and I'm going to call this front end, just to keep it super boring and generic. So it's going to download all my React libraries. Again, this does take a while, so we're going to have a minute on our hands where we just, contemplate life, think about what we want to eat for dinner tonight, whatever you guys want to think about during this time. But I'm going to look at my notes and kind of get a game plan of what I want to do here. So again, you can kind of do this in any order, but I usually prefer starting at the top by creating my router and kind of figuring out what routes I kind of want for my application. Based on those routes, I'm going to have some landing pages. I'm going to create some pages after that. After that, I'll create some child components that can organize my data in a better way. That's all just scaffolding, as in just creating the structure of my site. It's not going to have any meaningful data. Once I get the scaffolding in place, I'm going to start attacking my API and leveraging the data that I have to use. I did kind of fail at creating some seed data during the break, so we'll need to do that together. But styling will be probably optional, but something I enjoy doing, so I'll do that on my own time likely. All right, so we are at our happy hacking message, which means our React project is in our front end and ready to go. Okay, so let's get into our front end then. I'm gonna clear this, cd into front end. All right, so right off the bat, I know I want to use the DOM router, so I'm going to do an npm install React router DOM. And then kind of looking ahead, I'm pretty sure I'm going to need to use Axios. I'm going to install Axios right now since I'm installing a bunch of stuff. Install Axios for our API calls, which we'll do in a second. Are these actually installing? Yeah, we got Axios, we got router DOM. All right, looks good. I'm not sure what these vulnerabilities are, but I'm just going to pretend they're not there. Everyone look away. All right, so I got some libraries installed, React being the main one, but some additional ones also. All right, cool. Let's get right into it. So I'm going to do an npm start. Okay, so it's bringing up our default 3000 ports on a local host. This should be that spinning, hypnotizing React logo. I'm pretty sure Facebook is trying to hypnotize us here because Facebook did create React and Facebook is evil. So I'm just getting rid of that icon because I don't want to be hypnotized. So I'll delete this image. Bye-bye. Don't want you in my projects. Don't want any of this stuff. All right. So now let's kind of get, again, we're just going to be scaffolding here, kind of keep creating the high level items. So I probably want to have an H1 that says to-do lists app. And then my favorite element is the horizontal rule. So add that in here. But usually app is where we want to create our router. Again, we don't have to create an app, but app is our topmost component. So it usually makes sense to. So I'm going to import hash router from React router DOM. I'm going to need a few more items from here. We're going to need something called routes, and maybe link. I'm not sure if I'll use link, but we'll see. All right, so we have hash router. I'm going to create that at the very top level. Oh, did I delete my div? That's sad. I wanted a div app. We'll put everything in there. Oh, sorry, I do have that. I don't know what I'm looking at. Must be that lack of sleep. But all right, so in our div here, we're going to create a hash router instance right there. I'm going to drop everything in here. So right off the bat, I want to make that header, the to-do list item, a link so I can get back to my homepage. So I'm going to do that right here. We'll mess with that in a bit. All right, horizontal rule. Let's get into creating our routes. All right, so this is, again, the concept here is very similar to what we did in Django. Just what URLs will take us to what pages. But this is all done internally, as we're not actually leaving our React app. Because you remember, anytime you actually link to something outside your React app, it's going to reset your React app. So you're going to lose all your internal state values. So this routing is done internally, meaning we do not refresh the page or navigate away from our current destination. We do it all internally. So routes will have a few routes in it. So we'll do routes. Path would be homepage. So let's render something called homepage that does not exist yet, but we will create it. So that'll be one of our pages. What other routes do we have? I'm thinking, again, this is going to be showing a bunch of task lists, and we probably want to dive into a single task list. So I'm going to say task list. I don't know if I want to use underscores or not. We'll use dashes. This will have an ID. So this will be like a task list detail page. So let's call this task list page. Okay, so I'm thinking 2 pages right off the bat. We might need to add more later, but that's going to cover most of my front-end functionality. I want to link to my homepage here. So I'm going to create a link around my header just for convenience. So link to that. Okay, so I'm going to be very, very minimalistic on styling. Again, that's going to kind of hurt me because I love styling, but hopefully it won't look too unappealing. All right, so we got some messages here. So homepage and task list not defined, which would make sense because I have not created them. So I'm going to create a new folder just for organizational sake. Create a new folder called pages. In here, I'm going to create my 2 components that I'm using in my router. So the first one is homepage.js. All right, it's going to be a functional component. React functional component, homepage. All right, right now, nothing too interesting to see on it. So I'm just going to kind of stuff some stuff in here. Let's create an H2 and call this homepage. And another horizontal rule for good measure. All right, so that's my component for now. Again, just kind of stubbing out stuff that's going to have more content later. We also have a task list page component. So I'm going to create that. All right, I'm just going to copy and paste to save some time. So let's do task list page. Task list page. Okay, again, if there's any questions out there, let me know. But right now I'm just creating some just bare bones pages so I can link to them in my router. So let's go back to our app.js. So this is what our app looks like. We have, let's create some spacing here. We have routes down here. This is just kind of like acting as our header. I might want to create another component for that later on. Right now, I'm just going to leave it as a H1 tag. Yeah, so now we have a couple routes. If we go to just the base URL, localhost 3000, that should render our homepage. If we decide to go to /task list and ID, that should take us to a task list page. So let's test this out. I'm going to save that. We have some errors because I did not imported my pages. Just using VS Code to autofill, import task list page, and there we go. So we're going to save that. There we go. We got a green message, which means we're good. Well, let's take a look at our page now. All right, there we go. So this is what our site's looking right now. Nothing too exciting, but I can click on this and get to my home page. Notice we got that hash for the hash router. But I could go to task-list/77, which does not exist, but the page exists. I did not put anything there, did I? Task list, sorry. So do I want that to be plural? I'm going to go yes. All right, there we are. So we have the task list page at that location. Again, the number here doesn't matter right now. It's being ignored. We're not using it for anything. Any questions on our router? Andrew Simpson.
I believe we did cover this at one point, but I just wanted to ask again for clarification because I was reading the documentation for React router, and in the documentation, they specifically say like, do not use hash router unless you like absolutely have to.
Yeah,
So,
I saw that.
Yeah, I was wondering again what our rationale was for using it in these apps.
Yeah, so there are different types of routers. I'm more familiar with the browser router. I think the hash router, again, one kind of cosmetic thing is we get this hash right here. I believe, and Raphael might need to kind of jump in here, but I think the advantage of using hash router is that if we have kind of anchors on a page that we want to route to, it's going to be handled internally rather than us sending a request to the browser to do something. But Raphael, did I get that right? Or do you have any more something to add about hash router?
I'm sorry, I was multitasking for a second. Could you repeat that real quick?
Sure. Yeah, the question was, why are we using hash router? Like, what's the benefit? And then one additional thing on top of that is the documentation says do not use hash router unless you really need to. So I'm just wondering if you can kind of dive into why that's a better choice for us right now.
So my opinion on this is that they're mostly the same, except that when you use the browser router, there are certain bugs that can occur in certain situations. There are just some cases where the request will get accidentally sent to your server, even though it's supposed to stay on the client side. So like if you press the refresh button, or if the user just types the URL into the URL bar, that's going to send a request to your server. So you need to make sure that Django is prepared to handle those requests intelligently. If you're using the hash router, there's no situation in which a request that's intended to your front end is going to get accidentally sent to your back end, because this is just built into the browser already, that changes after the hash do not trigger requests to the server. So there's just a few bugs that you're never going to have to deal with if you use the hash router.
Gotcha. Thank you, Raphael. I think you mentioned one thing that I am curious about. So if I say homepage, and this might be a reason that I might be more in favor of hash router. Again, I'm more familiar with browser router, but they both accomplish the same thing. So if I type in task list page, Raphael, if I heard you correctly, are you saying, so if I go to my homepage and I bring up my console over here, I get homepage. If I type up here, it won't refresh my application. Is that right? Let's give that a try. Okay, cool.
Students, yeah.
Awesome. Okay, cool. That's something, that's always something that's always bothered me, I guess, about browser router. So in this case, we get to retain our application state while we manually typed it in here. So that's kind of cool. So that's one difference that hash router provides. But yeah, so I'm glad you're reading documentation, Andrew. I did read that same thing, but in this case, it's me very, very minor. So if you want to use browser router, it's not going to make a difference really for our use cases, I bet.
Got it. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, no, thank you for asking that question. All right. So I don't want to have these console logs and get rid of them, but we have our pages. So that was pretty simple. So we accomplished router, pages. Again, we might add a few more routes and pages, but right now I just want to go on to create our components. So how we're going to kind of show off our data. Again, we have no real data right now, so we're going to kind of create fake data to kind of see what our pages will look like. Let's go to our homepage and try to envision what we want our homepage to have here. So I'm thinking homepage, right? All right, so this is going to be kind of our, this is going to be akin to our task lists list page. So, here we'd see all of our task lists. Let's add a couple more. Let's say summer to-dos. Let's crowdsource this. So, John Winko, you're first on the screen here. What's something you want to do this summer? Just anything at all?
Go swimming.
Go swimming. All right. Summer activities. We need to create this task list. Sorry. All right. So now that exists, let's go create some tasks. So one task I want to do is go swimming. I think that's what I heard. And that's going to be part of summer to-dos. Let's say the due date. Let's say John Winko. I'm going to say you're going to need to get into a pool or a lake or ocean by, say, July 4th. So before the Independence Day, you're going to have to swim, and we're going to report back to us. We will hold you accountable to it. So this is not done yet. So I'm going to post this. All right, let's create a couple more items. Let's go with, who else haven't heard from in a while? Let's go with Aiden. Aiden, what's something you want to do this summer?
I'd like to go fishing.
Go fishing. All right, a lot of aquatic stuff. So go fishing. Aiden, I'm going to set a due date for you. It's going to be a little earlier. You're going to do that by, today's the 13th. You got 2 months to do it. So it's not quite the summer, but I guess summer actually doesn't officially start until there, but whatever. We'll put that there. Let's get one more item here. Let's go with, I feel like I haven't talked to some of you guys in a long time. How about Sukdev? Sukdev, do you have anything you want to do this summer?
Go on vacation.
Go on vacation. Yep, I'm sure we're all deserved a much long vacation after we get through boot camp. Let's make that kind of a more open-end one. Let's say by end of summer. Unofficial end of summer is end of August, I'd say. Let's do August. All right, so we have some items to work with here. So main reason I want to do that was, now if I go to my task list view, we see every single task list. That's what my homepage on the front end is going to kind of represent, just show every task list that is available to me. So let's go back to our React app. So I want to see a list of task lists here. Kind of hate saying that over and over, but I'm just going to kind of stub this out. So let's say we have an H3 that says task lists, plural. Here, I'm going to create a function because I know I kind of want to keep my render clean. So I'm going to say render task lists. Put that over here. Okay, so we're going to render some task lists. This is going to be a function that's going to be helping me. So render const render task lists. Again, if I'm going too quickly or have any questions, let me know, but I'm just kind of designing and scaffolding. Here, I'm just going to write some dummy data. It's going to create some, again, random elements just for our visual enjoyment. Let's push in, let's go with paragraph tags. I'll say task summary. Return elements. Okay, so that's what I'm kind of envision here. Again, not the best styling. Again, we might need to change some criteria, but I just want my homepage to show me every task list. So if you imagine if I have 5 task lists here, I would see the title of them here. What else can we do from the homepage? So thinking about, again, kind of just mirroring this, what I can do from the API view, I can also post to this view and create a new task list. So again, it's our design decision. I create a separate page to add a new task list, but I feel like the content's small enough that I could kind of nest that on my homepage. So I'm going to do that. That's, again, my choice, my page, my choice. So I'm going to go to add more content here. So I'm going to say, what if we added an add task list component? Actually, let's just do it a simpler way. So I'm going to add some stuff here. Maybe a form that's going to have inputs. Sorry, I just want to do this kind of quickly. So this input would have placeholder of enter name. Probably a button, create ends. We'll have to clean this up later, trust me. And it's going to be submit. Okay, let's see what this looks like. So again, just trying to get a good representation of what my site eventually will look like. All right, so yeah, that's kind of what I want, just a one-liner where you can add a new name for a task list, add a description. Obviously, this is not functional. That actually refreshed because I'm not preventing default. We'll have to do that later on. I'm not worried about that level of detail right now. All right, that's my homepage. I'm not gonna go too wild right now. Again, styling we'll do later. More content. I think there's a requirement on the challenge that we need to kind of separate out completed task list and non-completed task list. Not going to do that right now. I just want to have a kind of a bare bones what my page is going to look like. Okay, but I do know that when I click on these individual task lists, I want to be taken to a task list kind of detail page, and that's going to link to the route that we went to before. Oh, is there a question mark here? I don't know how to deal with that. All right. So let's create our second page. So second page was task list page. Here we're going to see, let me put the task list title up here. What do we want to see here? I'm assuming we just want to see a list of all tasks. I mean, there's not that much more we need to show here. Maybe a description. So we could do H3 task list description can go up here maybe. And we'll do another H3. All tasks. Okay, so this is going to be very similar to what we did before. Just create a function called render tasks that will put some dummy data for us here. So render const render tasks. All right, this isn't too much fun, but we'll get to actually doing real stuff in a bit. Let elements equal empty array. Let's do the same thing we did on our home page. So I'm just going to borrow code from here. Copy, paste. This will be a task summary. Okay, but now, as I mentioned, I want to actually link to this page from the home page. So I'm going to, start adding some functionality here. So I'm going to add a link to those routes. So I need to import link from React router down. Okay, so the link tag, again, that's used for internal navigation as opposed to anchor tag would likely take us out of our application. So I want to have links here. So let's do link tag. And where do we want to go? So we want to go to a route that we have created already. That route was /task lists. Let's actually make this slightly dynamic. So, all right, so we want to go to /task list plural, and we want some ID attached to it. So in this case, I'm just going to use the for loop ID to make life easier. We probably want a key. We talked about keys before. Okay, so hopefully it should take me to the task list page in my router. So let's test this out. All right, no errors, that's good. All right, there we go. So we got links now. So if I click on the third one, we should be taken to task list, I guess 2, because we're 0 based. So if I click on this one, notice we're taking to this. I'm not sure what this question mark is. That is bothering me. But anyway, we got here. So cool. So this is our task list detail page where we see all of our tasks listed. I'm going to pause here, just make sure I haven't lost anyone. Any questions lingering out there? Andrew Tran.
I feel like I forgot how to do this, but how does React connect to our database?
That's where our API calls will come into play. So if we go back to our notes, notes, we are handling pages and components now. API calls is how we actually wire into the Django server and get data from it.
Oh, okay.
So we'll make Axios calls to achieve that. All right, so we're almost there. We want to create some components. So I could do this now or later. Let's do that later. I think it'll save time if we do it later. So let's actually just jump to what Andrew was referencing. We're going to jump to our API calls. Let's get some real data here, and then we'll flesh out our components later, because I don't want to spend too much time kind of scaffolding. You guys cool with that? All right, so let's go with API calls. So now I want to create a new file, and this is just organizational sake, not required. I'm going to create a new folder, call it API. In API folder, I'm going to create a new file, call it to-do API.js. And we're going to add some code in here. So let's say we want to get all of our task lists, right? That's where our homepage is showing. So I'm going to write some code here. If you guys have any questions about it, let me know. I'm going to create an object and call it to-do API. It's going to be an empty object for now. But I'm going to populate that with members or properties. And the properties are going to be functions. So to-do API will have one called get all task lists. That is going to be an async function. This is going to use Axios. I want to import Axios from Axios. All right, so this is going to look something like return awaits Axios dot get some URL. Our URL base is going to be very similar. So I'm going to create a constant, say base URL. Where are we going to go to right now? So our server is running at http://localhost 8000 / to-do API /. So that's our base path for every call we're going to make. It's going to go to the to-do API URL. So we'll do maybe a string interpolation here. Yep, that's what I want. $, base URL. And we can add on here. So for the case of getting all task lists, we need to go to task lists /. One thing that might be confusing, hopefully it's not, is I have named my front end routes and my back end routes kind of similarly. That is kind of accidental, not necessary, but here I do have task list as a route, but my back end also has task list as a route. So hopefully we keep those separate. But okay, so Andrew, question?
So conceptually, for this thing to work, both React and Django have to be running at the same time on 3000 and 8000.
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
All right, so this is what one of my calls would look like, but I'm going to kind of get to that pre-optimization concept that we talked about before. I know this is not just what I need. We want to write safe code, meaning we're going to need some try catches here. Jesse, do you have a question?
Yeah, just to reiterate the task lists that you're having at the end of the base URL is off the React or the back end?
Right here. This is
Yeah.
the back end. So this is our
Backend,
base.
okay.
We're going to 8000 and going to task list. Yep. So the Axios calls are going to hit up our back end. Always good to make sure though. All right. So this is my structure. Basically, I create an object, populate members in the object, which are functions, and then export the entire thing. Let's maybe comment that stuff to export. Oh no, we are in JavaScript world. What else? Oh yeah, so this is where I'm going to get to kind of creating a kind of a general function that's going to encompass all the safe code that I want to write. So I'm going to call this const try catch fetch. That's a personal naming choice. This will take in one parameter. It's going to be the Axios call. And this is going to do all the error handling for me. So I don't have to do that in individual API calls that I create. So here we're going to do a try and catch. We're going to catch an error. And then we'll probably want to console.error. So let's say error. All right, so we get an error, we return null. So we will need to check for that. Otherwise, we want to go through our API Axios call. So we'll do const response equals await Axios. And again, this is a good time to do a short review. I feel like I don't want to just, be coding without discussing concepts. So we actually need this to be asynchronous so that we can await this call. Why do we need to await this? Let me ask an audience member. Saruchi, could you tell me what Axios is returning when I call to Axios?
I'm gonna take a guess.
Sure. So when we call Axios right here, like we're doing right here on line 22, what is it actually returning? Do you remember?
Our task list.
So that is ultimately what we do want. But the key thing here to keep in mind is that this is an asynchronous call. So .get is saying, again, the way I kind of just generalize it is I'm asking a friend to go get me something. So here, when I say Axios get, I'm saying, hey, let's say my friend's name is Axios. I'm saying, Axios, can you go get me something from the grocery store? So Axios is not going to immediately do that. It's going to take some time for Axios to go to the grocery store. In this case, the grocery store is our API on the back end, or our Django API. So Axios is going to go and retrieve whatever I asked it for, but it's not immediate. So due to that, what Axios is going to return to us, what this call is going to return to us, is a promise. That promise is something that's going to eventually resolve to what we requested, or could be a failure. So again, a promise is a very complicated data object in JavaScript, but to boil it down, it's a guarantee. It's a promise that we're going to get some response. Now, it's not a guarantee of success. It's a guarantee of some response to our request. So when we get a promise back, the promise will either tell us if it succeeded in what we asked for, or if we failed. But either way, we're going to get notified. So the await keyword here says, wait for that promise to actually resolve. So without this await keyword, response here is not actually what we wanted. It's going to be a promise that's going to resolve to what we want. So again, promises do take a hot minute to kind of understand. So I wouldn't blame you guys if you guys are still kind of fuzzy on it. But just understand that Axios is not immediately going to give you what you want. It's going to the grocery store. It's going to take some time. We need to wait for it. So in an async function, we can add the await keyword that says, wait for this promise that's returned to resolve before we proceed on with our life here. So if we await, we get what we want. In this case, we get a response object. Once we have the response object, we return response.data. And the data is actually what we were looking for. So the get request will fill the data here, and we'll get task lists in this case from response.data. If we get an error though, the catch will handle that, and it'll go through this part of our code. But the promise will give us a result either way. We got some hands raised, so let's definitely answer some questions here. Jesse.
Sorry, I left it up again.
Okay, no problem. John Price.
Yeah, so the await, that kind of does the same thing as the .then would do, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Absolutely correct. I'm glad you mentioned that. So you might have seen .then in our code. You might see .then in examples. It is doing exactly the same thing, just in a different syntax or different construct. In my opinion, .then is a lot more confusing and probably a little bit more code than async await. I know I worked with a couple students where we kind of converted a .then structure to await, and it just removed tons of lines of code, and it also, in my opinion, made it much easier to read. I think this was a case where he had a promise within a promise. Those get kind of complicated with .then, so I would wager, or I would recommend always go the async await route. But it is important as developers to understand how to use the .then construct. Don't kind of wipe it from your mind. Make sure you understand how to do it in either way. We could try to do it, in two different ways here, but and at that point, I'm not going to do that right now. But we could try to do it later if we have time. Andrew Tran.
I think you already answered it with what you were writing, but your try catch fetch is just a helper function in your code that you're writing on lines 22 to 24, right?
Correct. So yeah, I'm doing something a little sneaky is the wrong word, but kind of more intricate here. So I have this helper function that's going to do all the safe part of my coding. just in one place. I'm passing in something called Axios call. This is actually a function. Notice I'm creating an anonymous function here. And again, I know anonymous functions can be a little tricky to digest, but at this point, I'm gonna say we need to be good with anonymous functions. So understanding here, I'm creating a new function. I am not calling a function. I'm creating a new function that I'm passing, and it's gonna be accepted as Axios call here. When I wanna actually call the function, I tack on the parentheses here. So this is gonna execute my Axios call. In this case, it's gonna call this anonymous function, which calls Axios.get. All right, I know this is kind of maybe confusing. Why am I doing this? It's just to kind of save writing more code later.
Why do you need a wait on line 23? Because your try catch function already is a asynchronous function, right? Like it won't return the code until all of it goes through, right?
Good question. So this is some of the magic between async await. Any function that you create that is async is going to return a promise. Even though right here, it looks like I'm not returning a promise, this actually gets wrapped in a promise. It's a little hard to understand, but just the high level is, or the quick takeaway is, any async function you have always, no matter what, is returning a promise. Even though this does not look like a promise, this doesn't look like a promise, but gets converted to a promise due to async. All right, so this function, try catch fetch, is actually returning a promise in both cases. One promise will result to this, one promise will result to that. So we do need to await here, because any async function is going to return a promise. Therefore, we need to wait for that promise to resolve.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I have also a request. Can you print after everything? Can you print the constant to do API so we can see it after
Absolutely.
everything?
Yeah, good request. I'll do that. John Price, do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, this kind of goes off of what Andrew was asking earlier about in order for this this application to run, you need to have the front end on port 3000 and the back end on port 8000. How's that going to work when we start using the build and the scripts and start watching in order to put it all on the back end?
Yeah, we will talk about that. So we're going to get to that, I want to say, in the next 10 minutes, probably in 5 minutes. So stay tuned. But if I don't answer your question, let me know.
It has to be console log, right? Instead of print.
Thank you. Yes, yes, yes. Those context switches are rough. I'm sure I don't have to tell you guys. All right. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to print out response.data also. Sure. Okay. So we have one API call. Let's wire that up and let's make sure it works. We probably could have used Postman. I actually have Postman queued up here. I did not test my endpoint, so that's probably something I would normally do, test it in Postman before I even get to my front end. But again, interest of time, I'm just going to kind of jump to the front end. So I have this one function. Let's go to our homepage and use that API call. So we need to import our API module. So I called it to do API. That's where we're going to need to start adding our usual component items. So we're going to have state values. And we're going to have effects. Hopefully you guys are a little comfortable with this, or very comfortable with these concepts. So this is going to be task lists, plural. It's a list of task lists. And we're going to have our setter function, task list. Again, we're using a state value, and just to review our React concepts, the reason we need to use state values is because these values will be monitored by React, and they will automatically trigger a re-render of our component. Without using state values, if we just have like local variables or global variables, our internal values would update, but our display would never update because React would never know that we're updating those values. So state values are specifically variables. They're glorified variables, or like magic variables that React can react to, for lack of better words, and update our display for us. So that is why we create state values and not just local variables. All right, so I'm going to initialize this to empty list because it's going to be a list of lists. Now we need an effect. So I'm going to do use effects. Again, this is going per documentation. Initial API call should be wrapped in the use effects. You could maybe get away with not doing that, but I'm going to say that's going to be bad design. All right, so the dependency list here, empty array means do this only once on initial render. Keep in mind, if you leave this dependency list off, if you do this, this is actually not what you're gonna probably want. This is going to run this use effect every single time anything changes in your component. Any state value, any prop value, anything that could trigger a re-render is going to trigger this use effect. That's going to be bad if you have an API call in there, because you might, get into like, violating maximum API calls if it's like a third-party API. So again, always remember, empty dependency list is most likely what you want. You don't want to leave it kind of naked so that it runs every single time. Again, there are use cases for it, but I'm going to say probably not something you're going to run into. I'm going to call a new function and call it load task lists. That's going to be a helper function down here. And this is where we're going to use our API. So I'm going to do const data equals await. Don't forget your await keywords, easy to drop them. If you leave them off, you're going to be returning promises and not the data you want. So just a heads up there, get all task lists. Okay, let's talk about some of the design decisions we made here to make sure we are all on the same page. So one thing that you might be thinking, maybe you are, maybe you're not, is, well, why did I create a separate function here? Alternatively, I could have just copied this logic, put it right here. Can someone tell me an issue with this code that I've highlighted right here?
I was thinking maybe you might want multiple other functions to be run while your use effect is initializing when you first refresh the page. So maybe you would want to just, to keep it less spaghetti coded.
Yeah, again, one, it's organizationally, I think it's easier to read. But specifically, the code I've highlighted right now has one major issue in it. I'm using await outside of an async function. So remember, await can only be used in async functions. So, well, that's simple to fix. What if I just do this, right? I don't need this function. But this is not proper React design. If you run this code, it will work, but you'll get a strong warning in your console saying use effect should not be async. So again, we are passing a function right here to use effect. That function should not be asynchronous. There are specific reasons why this should not be the case. I'll let you guys Google it, but the short of it is, do not do this. Do not make the function you are passing to use effect asynchronous. You'll see a warning. Bad things could happen. I don't want to, be too alarmist or scare you guys, but most likely it'll be fine. But you're violating React's kind of design desires here. So instead of passing an asynchronous function to use effect, we pass a synchronous function to use effect. But inside of it, we can call as many asynchronous functions as we want. What am I doing? Not local storage. I call this function load task list. All right, so I'm kind of just shifting away the asynchronous functionality into a separate function, so I could use async away and it'll work just fine. Again, the function we are passing to use effect must not be asynchronous, but anything you do inside of the function that you pass can be asynchronous. Any questions on that? Okay. Another thing I'm just doing right here, basically, if I get null back here, I just want to set it back to empty list instead of null. That's going to make my code a little easier so that I'm always guaranteed that I have a list that I'm working with and not a null value. That's just a design choice. Again, we can get null back if we get an error here. All right, the last thing we need to do is we get our state value. We set our state value from our API call once that returns. Last thing is we don't want to go through and create dummy data. Let's actually create real data. I'm going to use some array functions here, so hopefully that's not going to scare anybody. I'm going to do return task list dot map, a good old map function, takes in each individual task list and an index. That arrow function, we want to return right now we're going to return paragraphs that are going to have links on them. I'm not sure whether we're going to link to right now. Maybe not. Let's have a paragraph. And so this will have task list dot name as a display. All right, we did have link tag, my bad. We want to link to what we're linking before. So to, what do you want to link to? We want to link to / task list. Again, this is on our front end, not our back end route. And then we need the ID here. So it's going to be $ task list ID. So that's where we're routing to using the task list. And then we're showing the task list name right here. Our link tag needs to be in the proper spot. All right, there we go. So now we are, again, a lot going on here. We are taking our array, we are mapping through it. So remember, the map function creates a new array based on the original values. It does not modify your original item here, so that's kosher. We get past 2 items. We get past the object or the item at each index, and we also get the index value, which we should probably use as a key value. I know we kind of talk about it, but not really. But just something we'll get warned about if we don't. So that's what my homepage is going to do. Just walking through all the steps. We have created an API call here. We're calling Axios and saying, hey, get me stuff from the grocery store, also known as our Django backend. Get it from this location. We do a bunch of awaits, meaning we have promises we need to wait for them to complete. In our homepage, we're going to call this function, get all task lists. That makes our Axios call. That is also going to return a promise, so we need to await the results. Once we get it, that's going to be the data that we're looking for. Assuming it's not null, we can set it in our state value. That state value is going to trigger a re-render. And this time around on that re-render, we're going to have actual values in our task list, which should populate down below here. So a lot of wires, a lot of things we connected here. Well, let's actually see if this works or if I've missed a step, which is quite likely. So I refresh here. Okay, so I didn't miss a step here. So if I go into my console, we're going to see an error. Not the error that I expected. Each list, task list page. Task list page. I guess I need a key value here. Does that make it happy? Okay, so if I go to my home page, this is where I'm going to see that error that I was expecting here. All right, notice we got some scary looking stuff here. What's going on? This is something I expected, but not something that you guys maybe expected. So we're not actually getting our data. Notice that we populated nothing here because we were unable to get to our backend. If you kind of read the specifics, it's not always crystal clear, but notice it mentions something about CORS policy. This is something we're going to need to deal with because we have our front ends on a different location than our backend. Luckily, it's super simple to solve, but we need to solve this on Django side. So we're going to take a quick detour from React. We're going to fix this up and we'll take a break because I know we are probably due for a break soon. So if I go to Django, this is something that you're just going to have to keep in mind. If you have your front end separated from your back end, go to your Django project. So I have my terminal right here. I don't need to run server because that's running already. We need to install something that's going to help us resolve this problem. So I'm going to do a pip install Django cores headers. I'll leave that up for a second in case anyone's trying to follow along. This is a library that's going to kind of do the cores magic for us. All right, so I'm going to run pip install Django cores headers for my backend. Again, I'm in my backend, not the front end. So this should install a library. Can you give that a run? All right, so that was pretty quick. We got Django cores headers. Probably a good time to do a pip freeze again. So I'll do a clear pip freeze since we installed a new library. Okay, so let's go back to our backend quickly. Look at our requirements.txt. We should have a new library called Django-cores-headers. Should be version 3.11. I would expect all of us to be using that. All right, so let's actually see how we use this. Again, documentation is how we kind of get through learning new technologies or new libraries. So let's actually just Google pip Django cores headers. We should get to PyPy. That's the site for pip libraries. So if I go to Django cores header, should be the first result. This should give us a good introduction on how to use this library. It's actually pretty simple, so not going to scare you guys. So we installed pip install Django cores headers. We need to go through a few more steps here, and they kind of guide us through what we need to do. So one thing we need to do is in our installed apps in our project settings, we need to add something called cores headers, all one word. This is not a naming choice. This must be named cores headers. So I'm going to go do that right now. Go to my project settings, find our installed app section. Looks like we just need to add another buddy here. So again, I just copy and pasted so I don't make any typos. But again, this must be named this for Django cores headers. All right, so we add that installed apps. Let's just continue following along what they're saying. In the middleware section, we've not dealt with this section before, but in the middleware section, looks like we need to add cores middleware, and specifically, it needs to be above Django's middleware. So make sure you read the directions correctly and closely. So I'm going to copy the cores middleware and put it right above Django middleware. So again, there's common middleware. Cores middleware needs to go above common middleware. All right, so let's put a comment here. Must be above common middleware. All right, again, I'm just following directions. That's not something I guessed. That's not something I just magically knew. The tutorial page here kind of guided me through it. All right, so those are 2 settings we need to mess with. Now we need to add one more configuration. We need to tell Django which front-end URLs are allowed to access or make API calls to our backend. This is a security feature, right? We don't want the world making API or making calls to our server if we don't, trust them. So we're going to tell Django who we actually trust to make API calls here. So I'm going to copy the cores allowed origin section as a template here. I'm going to put that right below my middleware. It doesn't really matter where it goes. But here I need to specify who is in the club, who's in the cool club, as in who can actually call our Django backend. So it's going to be local host 3000. That's where our React domain is. So this is location of front end React server. One important thing, do not put a trailing slash here. If you do, you'll get an error when you try to run your Django project. So easy mistake to make. I've made it many times. Just do not have the ending slash. You just want the base domain here. All right.
I have a question.
Sure.
Does this mean that this app we're creating, are we going to keep it separate or are we going to put it together at some point?
That is up to us. When I say us, it's up to you. Right now, I'm going to keep it separate just because, again, it's easier for me, especially with that hot reloading. I like keeping it separate. But again, there are advantages and disadvantages of how you deploy it. So I know a student had a question about it, but kind of just like some simple thoughts that I have. Keeping it separate, the advantage of that is you can deploy separately, as in I can deploy my database to one file hosting service and my front end somewhere else. Like I did that actually for my Netflix review site. I deployed my front end to GitHub pages, and I deployed my backend to Heroku. So you can keep those separate, and so that if I want to switch out my front end and use like an Angular JS project or a Vue.js project, my backend would not care and would not need to be modified at all. I can update the front end freely without having to redeploy my backend, right? Those are separated, or they're separate concepts. So I think that's one advantage of keeping it separate. You have less, entanglement, so your backend can just do what it wants to do without worrying anything about the front end. One disadvantage I would say about this approach compared to what we did earlier with Raphael, where we combined everything into one project, is deployment gets a little more, involved, right? We need to deploy 2 things instead of 1 thing. So again, that adds to our maintenance costs, I guess. But again, there are probably other trade-offs you can kind of surmise or Google. But yeah, these are different approaches, but we're doing the same thing essentially. We're still making an API call from our front end to our back end. It's just how we organize our files and create our projects.
if we do it this way, would we like, if we do this for like our personal project, would we have to like, would we have to put both into AWS, or we do like one in AWS and one in Heroku or something like that?
It's up to you. You can do both in AWS. You could do one in Heroku, one in GitHub Pages. I'll leave it up to you. So yes, in this case, you would have to create 2 separate projects on AWS to deploy them separately. Or again, you can merge them later. There's nothing inherently stopping us from merging them into one project. There's just a few other steps we got to follow. But in this case, since we are keeping them separate, we do need cores allowed origin. So that's the key takeaway here. And then now that we have this here, we should be good to go. That's the only thing that we needed. Again, aside from the small additional changes, this is the key thing that's granting us access from the front end to the back end. So with this in place, let's try making our API call again. Notice I did not change anything on my front end. There's no tricks here. So let's try doing this again. Hopefully I have everything wired up correctly. I want to make sure my routes, yeah. All right, so I'm going to refresh my page. Let's clear our errors. Refresh. There we go. Notice I changed nothing at all on my front end, but now we're actually getting data back. Notice we have our to-do list. We have our weekend to-dos. Oops. And we have our summer to-dos. I guess to-do singular. But that just worked once we specified that our Django server could accept API requests from localhost 3000. All right, so again, just want to emphasize, if we keep our front end and back end separate, we need to go through this additional step of installing Django cores headers and making sure we add our front end location to the allowed origins. Okay, with all that said, I think we are definitely deserving of a break. So let me pause recording here. All right, questions, Andrew?
I just have a request. I really want you to walk through one of the anonymous functions because I keep getting confused like about them.
Sure.
Like
Absolutely.
Like if even better if you did like one of the long ones.
Sure, we can do that. You said anonymous functions or async functions?
Both, because they kind of combine in certain like ways, right?
I'll give you a not quite. They're distinct concepts. We could cover both. All right, we could definitely make time for that. Sean, do you have a question, comment?
Yeah, just to summarize, so the reason we had to do that course header stuff is because we're keeping the backend and front end separate compared to like how RAF had it, right?
Correct. Yep. This is strictly because we have our front end and back end running from separate locations. The way we did it before was React was nested within our Django project, as Django was serving up our React front end. So they were both in the same kind of domain or same location. So there's no issues with like Django not trusting it because Django was the one serving it up. But this, again, we need to tell Django who to trust because it's a dangerous world out there. We can't trust everybody. All right, so Andrew had a request to talk about anonymous functions and async functions. Happy to do so. Where were we? To do the API. So anonymous functions, again, they're just kind of a developer-friendly way to write functions in a quick and concise way. Right here, I've created an anonymous function. We could write this another way. So what if I created just a standard function, no anonymous functions here. Do my Axios call. All right, so we create a function, drop this bit of goodness in here. And now I could just pass the function name, not Axios. What I've done here is exactly the same thing, functionally speaking, that I had before. Now I've created a separate function that, notice, when this function gets called, it's going to call the Axios that I want. I do need to probably await here and async here. Okay. But yeah, what I've done here is exactly what I had before. The slight difference is I create a function beforehand and then just tell my try catch fetch that, hey, here's a function that you should call. This is very similar to what we do with like event handlers, right? When we write an event handler, if we want to do that really quickly, I don't really have a good case here. Oh, I do have a button. I have a button here. So I have a button right here on click, right? When I specify an on click event handler, I don't call the function. I just say, you know, handle handle, what is this? New create task list. I don't know what to call this. Again, this is going to be a function that onClick will call when it needs to. I am not going to call right now, meaning I am not putting parentheses right here right now. That's the same concept as what we're doing with my try-catch fetch. I am telling try-catch fetch which function to call when it wants to call it. I am not going to call this function right now, meaning I am not executing this right now. I'm going to do that within my try-catch fetch function. So here I'm just telling try-catch fetch, here's a function. That's a parameter we accept. And then again, we call it when we want to inside of that function. So again, this is maybe a little more cleaner to understand, but again, anonymous functions are just less code and slightly better design because this function is never going to be called by anyone else except this single line in my code. If I were to call this by someone else, then yeah, I would create a separate function and have both of them call that function. But in this case, this is the only place in code where I want to do something. So I'm going to create this function right here. And it's going to call that right here. So both are doing the same thing, but this is less code and kind of more concise. I guess that's the same thing. So again, creating a new function that I've highlighted right here, that function will call Axios when we actually call this function that's called Axios call. Sorry, a lot of same names there. Andrew, did that make sense? Did that make things worse?
It makes sense. I just always get confused. Like I feel like I asked the exact same thing on lines 24, 25. If you took out async and all you did was return try catch fetch.
Yep. So this gets to their discussion about async functions. This has nothing to do with fat arrow functions. Okay, so this is async functions. If I do it this way, looking at try catch fetch is an async function. And let me maybe introduce our other construct here. I know this is going to be kind of a small tangent, but it's worth discussing, I think. Let's write another version of this. So I'm going to write to do API get all task lists. I'll just call it 2, lack of better name, whatever. There are 2 different ways we could do this. Async await, which I just got rid of, or we could do a .then contract. So if I do return try catch fetch, same call, but instead of using async await, I could do .then. .then would get the data that's returned right here, and then we take that data. Again, if you're more comfortable with try catch fetch, or sorry, with the .then contract, this might make more sense. Okay. So this is the .then contract. This, let me, if you don't mind, let me just put this back for now. Both of these do exactly the same thing, just with a different construct. Async await is one way to wait for promises. .then is another way to wait for promises. What's going on in a .then is we call a function right here that returns a promise. Try catch fetch returns a promise, regardless if this were async await or .then contract. Just accept that this is returning a promise. How do we handle it from the calling side? One way is we can put a .then, which is basically saying whenever this promise returns, call the .then function and do whatever we want to do here. So basically, when the promise returns, we're going to get a data object back. We're going to accept it and do whatever we want with it. So .then is going to actually wait for that promise. The .then does not execute right away. It's going to execute only when this promise that's returned from try catch fetch resolves. So here we are returning a promise. This entire thing is a promise. All right, so we're returning a promise here. So whoever is consuming this would need to know that this is a promise and need to .then it or await it. Both are doing the same thing. Await, on the other hand, does things a little differently. So await, sorry, it doesn't do anything differently. It's just different syntax. So await is doing the same thing that .then is. .then will be called whenever the first promise resolves. Await is going to return whenever the promise resolves. So I can do let data equals that, return data. This might be more clear. This data is the same data right here. So notice we wait for it here, we grab it and then return it. The same thing is going on with .then. .then is going to wait for the this promise, original promise, to return something. It's going to return data, and we're just going to choose to return data out of that. Either way, this and this function are returning a promise still. They are not returning data, they're returning a promise that's going to resolve to data eventually. I'll leave this up for a second, and Andrew, I'm going to ask you for a follow-up.
Oh, no, I totally understand now. The reason why we have to do it, I think that helped a lot, is like, I keep thinking we're going to return data, but we're not. We're returning a promise.
Correct.
And that's why await async always has to be there. But what if inside our try catch fetch function that was asynchronous in the first place, could we get it to not return a promise and just return the data at the very end?
Nope. The way, so without getting too into it, JavaScript is synchronous. Everything is going to execute immediately, but it's not going to complete immediately. That's a distinction. Promises, anything that's asynchronous is not going to complete right away, but it's going to execute as we send it off, to our friend. Like if I was kind of making that analogy, let's say Andrew, we're hanging out, and I got a party that I'm prepping for. I'm like, Andrew, hey, can you go to the grocery store get a gallon of milk, right? While you're getting a gallon of milk, I'm still proceeding with my life, as in I'm prepping for the party. I'm not just sitting there on the couch waiting for Andrew to return a gallon of milk from the grocery store. I'm gonna be, vacuuming, I'm gonna be, prepping the snacks, etc. So me as the program is gonna continue doing whatever I want. Andrew eventually is gonna come back to me and say, hey, here's the gallon of milk that you requested. So at that point, I will proceed to do whatever I wanted to with that gallon of milk. So the .then will only execute when Andrew hands me the gallon of milk. So that's a promise that Andrew made to me, that he's going to return something to me eventually, but I don't know when. So that's why all these functions are returning a promise, because we don't know when they're going to complete. So we need to wait for them to complete, and then we could react to the data or whatever, the gallon of milk or whatever we were requesting. So again, I'm going to say this again, promises are very complex to understand. So again, I'm not going to blame you guys if you're still scratching your head. Definitely take some time to understand what we're just talking about here. Look up reference materials, because that's going to be doing you guys a lot more benefit than just us talking about it for 5 minutes here. But key takeaway here is anytime you see a .then or anytime you see an async function, know that is returning a promise. It is not returning what you want. It will eventually return what you want, not immediately. And that's my kind of monologue on promises. Any follow-up questions to that, anyone? Gillen?
Just a quick question. Since you're saying data here is a promise, does that means we need to use the promise.all somewhere to parse those data? Or is this the case?
Data is not a promise. This data is not a promise. This return value is going to be a promise, though. So right here, I have the data that I want. But when I return it, that gets converted to a promise. I know that's probably hurting a lot of minds out there, but just think about who's calling get all task list. Let's kind of trace it back. We're calling get all task list from right here. This guy needs to wait for data, because this is doing a bunch of asynchronous stuff. So we're not going to get data immediately. We need to wait for this to resolve. So this function, as we just talked about, is asynchronous, meaning it's going to return a promise no matter what. And that's what's being done kind of behind the scenes here. We are returning data. We have it at this point. This is half an hour has elapsed, and Andrew has gotten into the home, and he's got the gallon of milk. So he's holding the gallon of milk. We have it, but he still hasn't gotten it to me, because there's one more step, one more handoff that needs to be done. He needs to climb the stairs or take the elevator and get to my apartment and hand me the gallon of milk. So he has a gallon of milk in my apartment, right here, but the promise is not resolved. He has not gotten it to me, being the original requester right here. So imagine that, I'm the component, and I requested a gallon of milk or some data, whatever you want to imagine. I need to wait for it to get into my hands. So again, keep in mind, this is a promise that's being returned and not the data. I feel like I probably didn't explain that in the best manner, but again, it's just a series of promises that we need to wait. One promise waits on another for it to resolve until we get to a point where we can actually use the data. So again, we have a promise in get task list. We also have a promise from try catch fetch. Again, a lot of promises kind of being layered on top of each other. Eventually, we get to a point where we don't need to return anything, right? So if I get to homepage, if I want to return something from here, guess what? This is another promise now. But I don't need to return anything from here because we finally have data in the position in the hands of the person that needs it. Again, Andrew finally got that gallon of milk to me, so I can actually use it to do whatever I want. In this case, we want to set data. So we do not need to return anything here. So that's the end of our kind of promise feedback loop. All right, so you need to get the promise data to the place where you need it, then use it, and then stop returning promises. I'm going to pause there because I feel like I just talked a lot there. If you guys are still kind of hand wavy with promises, again, that's okay. Just make sure you follow up on it, read some resources, understand the high level concepts of what Axios is returning. Axios is returning you a promise that's going to resolve to a response object. Once it resolves to a response object, we can use it for our needs. Okay, so that was a good discussion, but we do want to focus on our project here. So we have about 20 minutes left. There's no way we're going to finish everything we want to. So we'll discuss if we want to continue after lunch, but let's kind of get through the next 20 minutes here. So we connected our front end and back end. Let's add some more functionality. Let's write some of our APIs here. So I'm going to comment this out because they're doing the same exact thing. Let me note that. All right, let's create a few more CRUD actions we're going to want to do. So I'm going to do 2D API. We're going to want to get create a new task list. So create task list. We're going to need to pass it probably some task list data. That's what the user is going to send us. We're going to send it to the back end so they can process it. So we're going to return await try catch fetch. All these are just going to be a simple anonymous function that we'll call Axios. In this case, we're going to post. Remember, we're adding data to the server, so that's a post request. We're going to post the same URL, so that's not going to change. And then we're going to pass task list data. Okay, so this is our CRUD operations. We're creating a new task list. Again, same construct what I had before. Let me just change this back. Return. Okay, so let's actually use this. Again, we're not going to get through all of our CRUD operations in the time we have, but I think getting our homepage kind of working and seeing how that will look might do us some good justice here. So I'm going to save this. This is automatically exported. Let's go to our homepage and refactor a few things. So again, I don't want any single component to get too bloated. So I'm going to take this opportunity to create some child components, if you guys will bear with me. So let's go to source, create a folder called components, and kind of abstract some of this logic out so this doesn't get too bloated. So let's create a new one called add task list component. And then I'm going to also create one called task list summary.js. And hopefully you guys can kind of understand what these might contain. But let's create a functional component. Add task list. This is going to have my form that I had on my homepage. Let's maybe split screen for once today. All right, so we have homepage over here. I want to move this form out of here because that seems like it could be baked into a child component. We're going to need to modify that form a bit. Render task list. So here, I'm just rendering a bunch of paragraphs. I want this to be a task list summary item. So let's create a task list summary component. React functional component. And I guess task list summary. Again, I assume you guys understand the whole purpose of this. Again, organizing our code, making it more modular. So I don't need to really sell you on it, hopefully. I'm going to move this entire thing right there. And now I'm just going to render a task list summary item. But we do need to pass it some data. So task list will be a prop. we're all good on what prop values are, right? They are values being passed from a parent component down to a child component. So we're going to map over our task lists in our homepage. We're going to create task list summary elements and pass down the entire task list singular to each summary item. So now we should accept props, and we need to modify our code a little bit. So this is going to be props. Props dot task list ID. It's going to be props dot task list name again, because we're passing a prop value called task list. Therefore, we can access it via props dot task list. Okay, cool. That's going to be my task list summary. I'm going to add a couple more things there, or one thing at least. A button that says delete. Let's call this class name button deletes. And I'm going to do some styling because I like some styling, but hand raise, Elon.
On your homepage, line 23, homepage, is a task list or last list in your task list component or props?
Thank you. That's, again, typing and talking, not my strong suit. Thank you for catching that. Thank you for always looking out for me, guys. Yeah, so task list is what we're getting from our map function. We're just passing that down and then rendering it. Nothing too exciting going on here. I added a delete button that just has an X on it. We'll see how that looks in a second. But the second thing I moved was the form. So let's actually clean up our form. So this is where we're going to hook in to our new API that we just created here. So we created this new create task list API. We'll use that in a second. So let's jazz this up a bit. So this will stay the same. I'm going to say we need to add some names for sure. So again, these names should match what your backend has in it. I guess they don't have to, but I'm going to match them. So name of this task list would be name. Name of this would be description. Description. We need to create a function without parentheses. I'm not sure why I left that in. So this will be event handlers. Const handle create task list. And make this async, which is totally fine. The reason I'm making it async is because I'm going to do something asynchronous in it, which is call our to-do create task list function. So I'm going to do const data equals to-do dot create task list. But we need to pass this a task list data object. So we need to get that from our form. So the way this is going to flow is when they click the button, there should be type submit. Otherwise, it won't work. Type is submit. We could do it on click here to be clear, but usually the better place to do this is in the on submit event. It's essentially the same thing, slight differences. I'll spare you the details, but I'm going to do an on submit event instead of an on click event for the form. So we got that. We need a method of post, I think, just in case that messes with our URL. Okay, so we have our inputs, name and description. We have our button submit. I think that's all we need. But now we need to extract the data in our handler here. So if you guys remember, a few things to keep in mind. Any event handler is going to automatically be passed the event object. This is not something we are passing, ourselves here. That is automatically passed by our browser to our event handler. So we can leverage that event object, which has a wealth of information that we want. One thing we want to do off the bat is prevent default. If you remember, the default behavior for submitting a form is refreshing a page. We do not want that. So I'm going to prevent that default behavior by calling prevent default. That is a function that exists already, nothing I'm making up. Next thing is I want to extract my data. So let's call this task list data. It's going to be an object. And then we need keys here. So let me clarify what I said earlier. The name you put here does not matter in this case, but the key you put here does matter. This key should match your models in the backend. I know that's kind of a long, far away stretch. It's really fragile, but we want this name to exactly match the backend because we are using Django REST framework serializers, which are going to automatically look for names in the data to convert it to the models on the backend. So make sure that your key values here match your model names on the backend. Okay, or I guess your serializer field names to be clear. But here we want to do events dot targets dot elements. We're gonna get it by name this time. So name dot value. And then we had description. We'll get it the same way. EBT dot targets dot elements at description dot value. Okay, I got some red squigglies because I forgot my sign. Okay, so this should be our task list data. Let's actually console log it to make sure it looks like what we expect it to look like. I'm going to say sending task list data should be task list data. Okay, and then we want to call our API. And don't forget our awaits here. If I do not put this await, I know it's kind of a broken record. If I do not put an await here, this is going to be a promise and not the data that I want. I want to wait for that promise to resolve, get the data, and then we could console log the data to make sure what we expect. So console log received data. All right, so what do you want to do here? This is a design session. We create a new item. What do you want to do after that? Usually you want to probably navigate to kind of inspect that item. So I'm going to say, let's navigate somewhere. We're going to use some router functionality here. So I'm going to import use navigate. This is a function coming from the router that allows us to direct our application to wherever we want to go. This is a developer thing, not a user thing, as in users aren't clicking on a link. We're just automatically sending them wherever we want to send them. So import use navigate from React router DOM. Here I'll get router params navigate. Any questions on anything I'm doing? Again, please ask. I feel like I'm kind of talking into a void here. Use navigate. And then again, this will be a function that we can call to navigate somewhere. So let's say if our data is not null, let's console log the data and let us navigate away. So I'm going to navigate to that particular task list. So to do that, I could simply string interpolate. Our route is task lists / the ID. And guess what? The data is the actual task list that I was interested in. So I could just use that. All right, so we're going to navigate away to task list data.id. I think that's
Line 8, do you have to have like let or const in front of navigate?
I do. You guys are great at this. Yep, so we do need that. This is JavaScript, not Python. All right, so assuming that everything works correctly, we are going to extract the data from the user's form with what they put in. We're going to send it out to our API call, wait for that to respond. It should respond with a newly created item. It's going to be looking very similar to this data we sent, but additionally, it's going to have the ID. The ID gets created by the backend, so we can only get the ID once we get a response from the server. Okay, so we have event handlers. Make sure we wired it up correctly. So they submit this. They should be able to get this. All right, let's test this out. Make sure our refactor didn't break anything. So let's take a look at our terminal. Front end. All right, we got one error. Link is not defined. That is in task list summary. Because I moved some code. Understandable. Imports link from React router DOM. Index is not defined. Oh, right here. So we probably can just use the ID. I don't think that should matter. That'd be fine. Link not, okay, so that's fine. Okay, so with this in place, let's see how badly we broke what we had. Let's go to the home page. All right, there we go. So this is my delete button, not quite what I want, but that should go next to it. I'll fix that later. But we have our items here. What is this HR? Sorry, I think I forgot something. Home page. Oh yeah, we forgot to use our new components. We want our add task list component here, which should be automatically imported because VS Code is a PAL. Render task lists. Oh, we don't want a paragraph anymore. That should be why. All right, so link. I think that should be fine. There we go. So we got the delete button on the same line. That's mostly what I wanted. Let's go with the space. If you guys aren't familiar, you can't add white space to HTML kind of naturally. You need to have these weird characters called non-breaking space characters. So I just want to have some space there. Let's do some styling. I know we're kind of just wrapping up here, but I want to add a little bit of CSS because that's one of my favorite things to do. So I have a button class called button delete that I made up. And this is going to be colored red. It's going to have a border of black, 2 pixels solid. Again, this is optional. You guys obviously don't have to do any of this. So color red, border. Let's add a hover. I know what I wanted. I wanted border radius. Border radius, let's go 40%, should be sort of roundy. And then this can be hover, will be some light red. Okay, so I just want to style a little bit. So there we go. So we got these buttons here. Those look okay. What if we did background color instead? Make them really pop. Background color red. So I can just do that here. Okay, let's see how that looks. So, all right, cool. Nothing too fancy, but I got my delete buttons looking a little more delete-y. All right, so let's check this out. We wanted to add a new task list. That's the last thing we'll do before lunch, and then we'll take a break for lunch. So let's bring up our terminal because I'm afraid something's going to go wrong. Let's actually see if I'm correct or not. So let's just make sure we know what we're doing. We are sending a post request to this URL. So we have to_do_API task lists. We are sending a post, which should let us create a new item. That is what our Axios call is doing. So if you guys want to make sure we look at the code, go back to our to-do API. Remember, we're doing a post request right here. We're posting and sending the data to the backend server. All right, let's give this a try. I'm pretty sure it's not going to work, but that's okay. New task list. Let's say we want to do 2022 goals. Stuff to do this year. All right, so if I hit add task list, that should submit the form. We should process the form, make the Axios call, get it back, see some stuff in our console, and be navigated to the task list detail page. A lot to do. Pretty sure it's going to fail. Let's find out. Okay, so we got a bad request. That is okay. So this is where I would go to taking a step back. We are in our front end. We kind of skipped some testing steps, but this didn't work, right? We sent a post. This was the data we're sending. I'm not sure what broke here. And there's actually something I want to do that's going to add some time for us. So I don't want to ruin your lunch. So let's actually take a break here. Recording. So if you remember where we left off before lunch, we were trying to add a new task list. So if I'd said, 2022 goals, we ran into an issue. I don't need a description. So we're sending the data that looks like this, but for some reason our server is saying that's a bad request. And now we need to figure out why this is happening. There's a few ways we can go about it. I think Postman might be a good opportunity to use Postman here, but I also want to kind of show us how we can actually debug this entire project. It's not the easiest thing, but it just requires a few steps to get this up and running. So if you guys don't mind, I'm going to take that tangent opportunity to get a debugging session running. So right now I'm just doing it all through my terminal. Breakpoints here won't be hit ever. Let's actually try to hit a breakpoint and also talk more about some of the intricacies of DRF objects we're using. So I'm going to stop my server here. You can go by, front end server can go die too. All right, So I'm going to set up a debugging session. It requires a little bit of configuration, but if you're following along at home, hopefully we can do it together here. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to the debug menu, which is the fourth icon, or maybe the third icon, depending on your plugins. That looks like a triangle with a little bug trying to crawl up it. So we can go there and go to create launch JSON file. All right, so if I click on that, it's going to give me an option of what do I actually want to launch. There are actually 3 pieces in my entire project that I need to launch here. So the first one's going to be a Python file. That's going to be my backend server. So I'm going to click Python file, and it's going to create this new folder called VS Code or .vs Code with a launch.json in it. This is how I'm going to tell my debugger how to actually launch that project. We need to modify this a little bit to get it working with what we have right now. So that's going to be our challenge right now. So first thing is I want to rename this so I know what I'm actually updating. So I'm going to call this backend server. It is a Python file. The program we want to run is not the current file. So this variable means the current file you're on. We don't want to run any file. We want to run one particular file, and that's our good friend manage.py. So to navigate that, we need to find where it is in our workspace. Our workspace is the app to-do list folder. Backend has the manage.py. So to get to it, I'm going to change my program to be, if I can, all right, maybe I need to type this in. It's workspace folder. So again, that's your current VS Code working directory / backend, because that is what I named my backend directory. You might have named yours differently. And then manage.py is what we want to run. But additionally, we need to provide it arguments, right? Like when we're typing it in the terminal, we type Python manage py, but then we also need to type one more argument. So that's going to go under args. And this is going to be run server. So this is effectively going to kick off a Python manage.py run server action, but the debugger will be attached to the backend. So that is one of 3 configurations we need. I'm going to leave this up for additional few seconds in case anyone wants to try to copy it down. Again, $workspace folder is a variable for your current working directory / backend / manage.py is how we get to the file we want. Okay, I'm going to add another configuration. So I'm going to go back to the debug menu, drop down, add configuration. All right, it's going to give me another list of what I want to add. This time I want to add, what do we want to do? We want to do npm start our server. So we want to do node launch via npm. This one's also a little tricky. So we go to launch npm, it adds a new section for our configuration here. I'm going to rename this to Frontend server. We want to launch it. Sorry, I need to look at my notes. So launch runtime args. We want to start it. So it's like doing an npm start command. And then we need to tell it where to actually find our directory. So this one requires one modification. Actually, so runtime arg should be start. Executable is npm. We need to tell it where our files are. So this is cwd, also known as current working directory. And we got to do the same thing. We got to tell it exactly where to find our file. So it's workspace directory / frontend. That is where our npm should be run out of, right? It's not the base directory, it's the front end directory. I know this sounds, again, kind of random, but this is what's required to get our debugger kind of looking in the right places. So that's our second configuration. We need to launch npm start. We also need to run Python manage.py, run server. The last one we need to add is add configuration. We want to launch a Chrome browser. So I'm going to select Chrome launch. And this is going to be our React application. Call that front-end app. Front-end app. We want to launch. Important thing is the port that we want to launch on. So normally we want this on 3000. So I'm going to change that to 3000. And the directory is front end.
Sorry, what was the configuration you just said?
I did add configuration Chrome launch. So hopefully you guys are using Chrome. If not, you might have Edge or some other browser. Any one of these should work, but I'm using Chrome. So Chrome and launching a new Chrome window. You can also do attach that has a slightly different configuration. I'm not going to mess with that because that's a little more involved, I think. So Chrome launch, and the only thing I added, or two things I added, was changing the port to 3000, and then changing the web root to be /frontend. All right, so those three in place. There's going to be one more thing I'm going to add just for convenience. I'm going to copy and paste this because I will not type it correctly. So these are our configurations. We can launch one of these separately or all three together. I'm going to add one more thing at the very bottom. This is outside of that list. And it's going to be called compounds. And this is going to launch all three of those configurations. So again, I know this is kind of hard to follow on screen if you're trying to, but we added three configurations, one for our front end app, which is going to launch our Chrome window at port 3000 from this directory. The second was npm start, right? We do that in our terminal. The same thing we're doing here. We need to just tell it what directory you need to run npm start out of. Key things here are runtime args and runtime executable. We didn't change that, but we changed this to start. And we changed the working directory. And the last one is the Python configuration. So we want to run our backend server, which is out of the backend directory. We want to run Python, manage py, run server are the args we're using for that. All right, and this little section down here, again, notice this is outside of the configuration array. So we have this array, we have a comma and a new section called compounds. This has just a couple entries, the name we want to give it, and the configurations that we want to launch all together. Okay, so these names are what I am targeting to launch. Yep.
So if you have been doing like Python tree, manage py, so for the types, that going to be Python tree as well?
Yeah, likely. Yeah, you could try it out. I guess I'm not quite sure, but yeah, if you're typing Python 3 in your terminal, then this probably needs to be Python 3 also. But I am not 100% sure on that. So with this in place, if you drop down your debug menu, so again, I'm in my debug tab here, you should see all the configurations that you have here. If I want to launch all, I'll select launch all, and then I'm going to hit the play button. This is going to launch everything in my debugger. So it's going to take a few seconds. So there's my Chrome window. It's going to try to connect, but nothing. The server's not up yet, so we need to wait a second. Let's make sure we don't have any errors. It's still running down here, if you can see. All right, so my backend server's up now. Front end server should be coming up. Okay, my front end server is running. Oh, there we go. It just takes a while. All right, so this is what we had before. Let's make that larger. All right, so now we're actually attached to a debugger. So if I actually do something in the front end code, I can set breakpoints and see exactly what's going on. If you want to test this out, let's go to our code now. Now that we're attached, front end, let's go to source, pages, or components, add task lists. Let's actually spy on our data here. So if I put a breakpoint on line 19, again, we're in add task list. When I hit the submit button for the form, we should get into this handler. And I should see this breakpoint actually being hit now, which is kind of nice if I want to investigate what's going on in the code right here. So let's actually try that out. So if I type in 2022 goals, whatever, there we go. Notice we hit this breakpoint. So we could kind of mess around here, check out some data values like, okay, this looks correct, description and name. In my object, I could check out, data if I want to set a breakpoint here. All right, we got data back. What does data look like? It's null, meaning we failed. So this had a failure, meaning we got null back. That makes sense. Again, that's the front end. But we can also debug on the back end. So since we've attached our backend code, we can go into to do app, check out anything here. But this is where it gets kind of tricky. We don't have much code to kind of spy on, right? A lot of it's being done in Django REST framework world. So we could set breakpoints inside of Django REST framework code, but I'd rather kind of try to snipe it kind of outside here. And we're going to learn a little bit more about DRF. And this is, again, coming from documentation. kind of understanding how we can customize our view sets if we want to, or customize our serializers. So if I go into model view set, just to kind of get a gauge of where I'm going, there's this create model mixin. This is one of the base classes for model view set. If I go in there, notice there's a create method. This is actually the method that is creating a new item when you submit a post request to a certain URL. So notice it's using a serializer, it's doing some data. I can't tell you exactly what it's doing, but this is the method that is creating an object when you send a post request. So what I'm going to do is override this so I can kind of intercept it and kind of see what's going on. So I'm going to do that via inheritance, which we're all very fond of, right? So I'm going to actually create a method, and this method must be called create. In fact, I'm going to copy it from the base code. So I'm just going to copy everything the base code's doing, just to get the headers, actually, to be honest. So I'm just going to get this part. All right, so now this method is going to be called first before the base class, right? Because we get first dibs on handling this. And I'm just going to call super and call the base class with whatever it's going to do, because I am not going to do the work for the base class. Star Args. All right, so I'm just passing everything I got in my create function and passing it down to the base class. I'm not doing any additional work yet. But what I want to do is intercept maybe any exceptions that are being thrown here. So except exception as E. We could print out this exception. So let's say error E. And then this is something that I kind of just had to figure out. This was trial and error. We need to re-raise that exception. If we do not, we'll get into some trouble. So again, the base code would do the same thing. If it threw an error, it's going to raise an exception. This base code might raise an exception. We're going to catch it here, print it out, and re-raise it, meaning someone else can handle it. This is what is expected of us. So now, what if I set a breakpoint right here? Because I'm thinking when we try to create something, we're getting an error. There's no guarantees I'm going to hit this breakpoint, but maybe I put a breakpoint here. Like we should, this method will automatically be called when we set a post request to the appropriate route that task list view set has created for their URLs. I feel like I said a lot of words there, but again, when we send a post request, this method will be called automatically. That's DRF doing the work for us. So now that I have breakpoints here, let's try to redo this. I don't need to add anything else in here. I'll bring up my inspector here. That could be bigger. Okay, so let's try sending this again, see what happens. So I'm going to add task list. All right, there we go. We hit this breakpoint. Notice that this is processing it. This is processing my request. If I look at my request, there's a whole bunch of data in here. Anything that we could view in here? Data right here. The data file, notice that actually has what I need. 2002 goals was the title. Description was blank. So it seems like the request did appropriately capture my values and sending them along. All right, so far so good. We're not in any trouble yet. We're gonna hit continue. So this play button. All right, notice we hit an exception. So whatever this code was trying to do, it did not succeed in its job. Something went wrong. And this is where I wanna try to figure out, well, okay, something went wrong. Maybe this exception has some information for me. So if I hover over this, let's take a look. Okay, kind of looking at this, it looks like invalid input. Let's look at the detail. I don't know if this is hopefully large enough for you guys, but the detail here says tasks. This field is required. Okay, that gives me something, right? Because I know that I'm only sending, where'd my front end go? I'm only sending two values, name and description, but that error message has told me that tasks is required. So again, this was a kind of a trivial debugging example, but some takeaways are we can hook into DRF by overriding their methods, intercepting it, calling the base class, and kind of doing whatever we want. Like I could print out something here in case I wanted to see the value of request.data. I can do that here. Like I have the opportunity to intercept the call through inheritance. Okay, if I make a change here, I do need to reload that. Oops, that should be the backend server. Oh, no, that should actually auto refresh. Okay, any questions on what I just did here? feel like that was probably pretty confusing, but using the debugger is a powerful tool. So key takeaway is you can debug if you want to. We can go over that at a later time if you're struggling with setting that up. Andrew Tran.
So I understand the debugger. I just got confused, like when you like put everything to run together at once.
Yeah, so again, I'm launching basically different projects together. So I did an npm start in my terminal. I did a Python managed py run server, and then I also had a browser running. So those are the three things that I configured with my launch.json. So it's just VS Code settings. We get to tell VS Code how to actually launch our programs, and it'll attach it to the debugger to that. Again, a lot of settings here. We'll go through it separately. So if you totally zoned out this part, that's fine. I just wanted to show that it's possible. Let's actually get to fixing this error. So I don't really need to do this anymore, so I'm going to get rid of that. So the key takeaway is tasks is required. So we look at our serializer. These are our fields that we're writing to. ID, we don't need to write to. That is going to be a read-only field. But we need to write to name, description, and tasks. Again, we don't need to write to all done because that is a serializer method field, which we said is read-only. So we have a couple options here. One is, well, do we want the user to send tasks? Like, can we create tasks? Can we create a task list? That's possible, but what if we don't want to force the user to create tasks, part of their task list creation? Well, here we could create a serializer. So we're gonna take the default implementation of the serializer, which, as I told you before, is primary key. So this is a default serializer. Anything that's a related field is automatically going to use primary key related field, meaning you're going to get just the primary key back for that value. However, I'm going to make one modification to it. So this is a many relationship that hasn't changed. I'm going to say this is read only. So now when I try to create a new task list, these are only two fields that are write only. This is read only. Sorry, these are read and write, but this field, and this field I've said are read only, which means we do not need to supply them when we're creating the task list. And you might be asking, well, how do I know all this? Again, reading documentation, figuring out, okay, if I want to make a read only, I need to set a read only flag on the serializer field. So I took the same serializer field that I would normally have, but I changed the default to be read only equals true instead of false. So let's try it now with this change. I'm curious if this fixes it. Let's go to 2020 goals. Clear this. Let's leave it blank. I think blank is allowed. There we go. It worked. Notice we have task list ID 3. These are details. Again, our task list page is not showing the details, but it did get created if you look down here. I think one adjustment that I could make that I think I forgot in my try catch fetch. I feel like I'm kind of bouncing around here, so I'll get back on track soon, I promise. I think you can actually print out the error message here if I remember right. So if I do I think it's message. Let's try this. I'm going to break this again just to make sure I could catch this error on the front end side. All right, so I'm going to take away that change, have this break again, and I want to see if I can print out the error message on the front end. So my key change for try catch fetch was I think you can get to the response through the error object if your Axios threw an error. Let's try that again. So let's say 2023 goals. No, I still don't get that. I do know it's possible, just don't know how. So I read that response. Okay, there we go. We got some data back. Let's see if we get the error message in there too. Okay, cool. There it is. So it's in data. So the same data that we would expect has the error message. That's kind of cool. So we need to check if that response is the thing. We should be able to get to the data. And that I think is a better way than going through that debugging madness I just went through. So let's close this. There we go. So simply put, tasks, this field is required. Clearly understand on the front end what's going wrong. So this is a little better than what we had before. But long story short, I can make that a read-only field, and now I don't need to send it when I'm creating it. That was probably a hectic 10 minutes. So let me pause here. Did I lose anything? Andrew, you just gave me the weirdest expression ever.
Yeah. How'd you fix it? I just wasn't paying attention when you did like the line where you
Gotcha. I
fixed
just
it.
uncommented the fix that we put in. So basically, I made the tasks field a read-only field, meaning you do not need to write to it when you are creating a new task value, task list value. Now, this might cause other problems, like if we're updating a task list and want to add new tasks, that might be something we might encounter. But we'll deal with that later. Again, these are just DRF kind of tips and tricks, kind of understanding that if you don't want the default behavior for the fields, you have the ability to override how they operate. Andrew, do you have a follow-up question, or was that a delayed?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I just left it.
Cool.
Thanks.
All right, so this works. I actually created a new task list, but it's not showing up right here. Let's create this one. So stuff to do next year. It should show up here if everything is wired correctly. Let's try it. Okay, so I go here, go back, and there it is, 2023 goals. All right, so we're doing some of our CRUD functionality. We did our create, we've done our read, obviously, because we're seeing task lists. Let's do our delete. I have these nice kind of delete buttons. Let's try to get the delete action going. So let's get back on track now. Go to my API. Let's close these files. My to-do API, I have a lot of files open. All right, so we had to create task list. Let's do delete task list. So I'm going to copy this, add a new function. Let's call this delete task list by ID. And as you might guess, we need to pass this an ID value. Task list ID. All right, so we need to do another Axios call. This Axios call is not going to be a post. It's going to be a delete. I feel like I should have gone over this before, but just as a reminder, we have a bunch of methods available to us. So we have a get to the list view. That's get all. We have a post to the list view. That's create new. We have put to the detail view. Get. We have get to the detail view. Again, these are HTTP methods that we send. That means get one. We have a put, which means update one. What else do we have? We have patch to the detail view. That is partial update one. This is all what your view set handles. When you send these appropriate methods, your view set's being like, all right, cool, you send me a patch. I know exactly what to do. And then we had delete to the detail view. That's our delete one. All right, so we're going to send a delete request. So I need to change this to delete, which I just did. We don't need to send any data with this. All we do is send the appropriate ID. So here the ID would be task list ID, right? Because we need to send it to the detail view, which is task list / some ID that we're acting upon. All right, so now we have our new API call called delete task list by ID. Let's go ahead and use that. So let's go to, I think I called it add task list. Let's see, task list summary. So that's where we have the delete button in task list summary. It's doing nothing right now. It's being styled, but let's actually make that functional. So in task list summary, I'm going to add an on-click handler to this delete button that I inserted beforehand. Let's say handle deletes. Right, again, I'm passing a function name and not calling the function. Hopefully we are good with that. So let's add an events handler section. This is const handle delete task list. We're going to make this async because, again, this is going to call an Axios function. So I'm going to do const data equals awaits to do API. I got imported for me. Thank you, VS Code. Delete task list by ID, and now I need the ID. So I need the ID of this task list summary item. So we need to pass that down via props. So let's make sure we have that, but we should have that already. So props.tasklist_id is what we want to delete. Once we get the response, we should be able to do something. So this is where it's a little different case than what we did before. Just to go back to our previous CRUD action, add task list. This was a little easier because once we added our new task list, we just navigated away from our home page. We went to the task list detail page. That saved us an extra step that we had to do for the delete case. So the delete case is we don't have anywhere to navigate. We're going to stay on the home page. So essentially, we're going to delete this one item. We're going to stay on the home page here. So that's going to cause one additional step we need to do. Because if I delete this right now, it'll be deleted from the back end, but the front end will not reload its task list. It's not going to know that this task list disappeared. So we need to manually remove it. So now I need to probably call a callback. We'll say props dot remove task lists. And then we want to do this particular task list. So we're going to pass down a function called remove task list. All right. So who's the parent of task list? It was homepage, if you remember. So go to homepage. Homepage is rendering a bunch of task list summary items. We want to pass in a new prop value called remove task list. So again, just to kind of make sure we have our wires understanding, we are calling the backend and telling the backend to delete the task list. That's going to happen, assuming everything works correctly. That happens, but the front end never gets notified that, hey, your list that you're showing right now needs to also delete it. So we kind of need to manage two different data sets. So remove task list will be a function. And if you guys don't mind me getting kind of, I'll do it on separate lines. So we'll call this remove. Okay, so this is a new function we need to create. Let's do that quickly. Const remove task list. And the goal of this function is simply to update the state value. We don't want that deleted task list still in our cache over here. So what I'm going to do is take in the ID, task list ID. And this is probably not the most efficient way, but that's the only way I really know how right now. I'm going to do const new task lists. It's going to be the current task list dot filter. That's one of our other handy dandy array methods, which takes in a task list and an index. I don't think we need index, but we only want to return items that are not equal to the task list ID. Basically, we're building a new list by omitting the task list that we just deleted by ID. So I'm going to return task list dot ID does not equal task list ID. We call this deleted task list ID to make it more clear. Okay, so we get our new task list, and now we could update our state value. Remember, we can't update our state values directly. That is a big no-no. So here we'll say new task list will take the place of our old task list. So now again, just following the wires, but I have errors here. Following the wires, we were passing down a prop value called remove task list, which is referencing this function. Task list summary is going to have a delete button, which will reference the ID for the task list that it's kind of managing. So when we call our backend API, we'll wait for the response. Assuming we get a successful response, we should remove it from the task list here. Now the question is, are we going to actually get some data? And the answer I'll let you know is no. So we're going to need to modify some of our code. So with a delete, we don't get any relevant data back, unfortunately. So this is where we need to kind of do it ourselves potentially. So I go back to my try catch fetch. I'm going to put a ternary here saying return the data or just return some generic. All right, because I don't want to return null from here. So I'm going to return some random dictionary that says, hey, success happened. All right, so with this in place, a delete action won't have any data, but we're just going to return some made up data just so our other components know that it was successful. So now we should have something in data which should tell us to remove that there. If not, we could say there's an error. Let's say console.error. I guess this would throw an error also. All right, so let's test this out. So I'm going to go over here. If our wires are messed up, then we only fix them. But if I hit X here, disappeared. Now the question is, did it actually disappear on the back end? Well, we could verify that quite easily. Go to my API view. So localhost 8000 /to-do API. Oops. Underscore. All right, so let's take a look at our task list. All right, let's take a look. We got weekend to-dos, summer to-do, and 2022 goals. The other one disappeared because we deleted it. So the back end deleted it, but then our front end, to update its cache, also deleted it manually. Now there are different ways to do this. It does seem kind of tedious that, hey, if the back end's doing something, should we be the ones deleting it from the front end, or should we just refresh our data from the back end? That's a designer call. Like again, it's a trade-off between if you refresh the data, it's more expensive, versus if you kind of assume that, hey, the back end said, okay, this got deleted, we can remove that from our front end. That's much more efficient, but also much more manual that you got to manage the data. I feel like I'm talking a lot, so I'm gonna pause here. What questions you guys have about deleting a task list? No questions.
I'm just gonna say I was kind of lost.
Okay. Jim, what are you lost? What are you lost on?
I don't know. I don't know. I just felt like I fell behind after we created the delete.
Okay, let's try to walk it back. Yep. So we created our delete API call. Key thing is we send a delete request and then send it to the detail view. So again, you need the task list ID as part of your URL. Maybe I want to have a slash there just in case. All right, so we have that in place. Our API call is good. Now we actually want to use that API call. So I have done this in my task list summary, which is being rendered by my homepage. So let's see how it's being rendered. So our render here is we're taking all the task lists that we fetched, right? So initially we call load task list, get a bunch of task lists from the backend. We store that in our state value. So now that's every single task list that the backend sent us. When we render it, we are rendering it by creating task list summary components. So we create these components and pass each individual task list to each individual task list summary. And now if I go to task list summary, we can do whatever we want. We can manage the task list from within this component. So one thing we're doing is we're deleting it. We're saying, if you hit this delete button, we're going to call the backend and say, hey, we want to delete this particular item. And then we're going to tell our parent that that task list got removed. So the parent should remove it from its data. I'm assuming that's still sort of unclear because I know there's a lot of wires that we're just kind of jumping through. Anything follow up there, Jen, or just need some time to process that?
I guess I'm just a little confused on the calling the API call or something on the homepage.
Calling the API. So the call is actually
remove task list function in the homepage.
Yep. So let's add some comments. This is just to remove the data. So we first tell Django that we want to delete something. Assuming that that goes okay, meaning we get a non-null value here, we are free to update our front end data appropriately. And the reason we need to do that is because we're not navigating away from this page. So when I hit this delete button, the first thing that happens is we call the backend and say, hey, delete this object out of the database. We don't want it, gone. The backend will do that and respond back to us eventually and say, hey, we deleted this item, do whatever the hell you want with that information. So given that we know that the backend deleted it, we don't want to see it in this list anymore. So we need to tell this homepage, hey, you have a bunch of task lists that you were managing before, but one of them got removed. So I'm going to tell you which one no longer exists. So that's what this function call is going to do. We're calling the parent, which passed on this prop value. We're calling remove task list with the ID of the task list that got deleted. Then we look at homepage, which is managing that data, right? Homepage is managing task list. So in our remove task list function, we say, all right, what ID just got deleted? We're going to go through all of our existing task lists and basically omit the one that got deleted and then update our state value. We got to do this because we can't update our state value directly. We can't just say, hey, delete the ID, the task list that just got deleted. We can't do it that way. We need to create a brand new copy essentially with the appropriate data excluded, and then we update our state value. I saw some other hands raised. John Price.
Yeah, so in the API folder in the to-do API, to-do API is just an empty object. And when you're referring to like API calls, you're calling the to-do API dot get all task list or whatever specific, like whatever API API call you're trying to make. What's the point of making an empty object instead of just, you know, naming the functions and then just calling the function specifically instead of calling the empty array dot whatever it is?
Yeah, so if I think I understand it, the reason I create this is just because I need to export something out of my function. So I'm basically adding new values by creating new functions and giving them entries into my object, and I return that object as my export.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, Andrew Tran.
So we kind of did everything manually, but if we did it like the real lazy way and we just refresh the page and cause it to re-render it, would it only be like 2 lines of code?
I mean, I wouldn't say it'd be quick. So I guess one thing we could do, yeah. So I guess the lazy way, that could have merit because sometimes you don't know what the server's doing and you don't want your data to get out of sync. So it is safer to kind of reload your data. So here in remove task list, when I call it, instead of doing all this business, it would be simpler and probably slightly safer to just do load task list. It's going to reclaim all the task lists, which means we're going to reset our data and it's going to re-render with all the task lists. So one example could be, let's say Andrew and I are using the same site and he deleted one task list and I deleted a different one. This refresh will give me his update and my update versus what I was doing before would only give you my update until I manually refresh on the front end. So again, just design trade-offs that you might want to consider based on your use cases. But yeah, this would be safer, but again, more expensive in terms of what if you had 1 million task lists? That's going to be a huge call to make to your API. Okay, Shun, you had a question?
No, I was gonna say the same thing. So like the easy way would just be to like reload the page.
Yep. Well, not reload the page, reload the data in the page. We don't want to reload our application.
Okay.
Yep, but reload all the task lists just to get what the backend server has. Obviously, the one that got deleted would not be returned with that new call. Okay, so we did add, we did delete. We were not going to do update. Update isn't too exciting, but we got most of this working. We haven't done too much with our task list detail page. We can do that quickly. So just get more API calls in here. If there's any questions, let me know. Again, I don't want to rush this, but I don't want to make this too long. So I'm going to add another API call. Let's call this get all tasks. That will be another async function. In fact, I'm just going to copy this because I'm kind of lazy. Don't want to type it all. So this is going to be dealing with tasks now, not task lists. So we don't need a parameter. We go to a different backend route, which is tasks. And then that's all we need to do. We need to do a get request here. So axios.get. We make that get request to our backend /tasks, and that should give us back all the tasks that we have. Let's make that a singular task because we probably don't need all tasks. So I'm going to get task by ID. I don't think we need to get every single task on a single page. So I'm going to say task ID Just gonna change our call a little bit. So we're still gonna need to do a get. We need to do a get to a particular ID. All right, so this is get task by ID, get one task by ID, and you'll see why I want to do one. All right, so we did that. This is going to be used on our task list page, right? We have a task list. Each of them should have one or more tasks that we want to see on them. So it's going to be the same thing we did with the homepage, just kind of repeat it for tasks instead of task lists. So here, again, we have dummy data. Let's actually change that. So we're going to do this one more time, just get more practice. We need to add some state value. So let's say states const. This will be tasks, set tasks. It's going to be a state value, so we use state. Empty array. All right, we need an effect. So this is going to be use effect. Same thing we did before. We're going to call some function. In this case, it's going to be load all tasks. That's what we called it here. Guess we just call it load tasks. This is going to be an async function. Remember, we don't want this to be async. We want this to be async. So let's not forget our dependency array. And now we'll do load tasks. This can be async. The arrow function. All right, so now this is going to call our API that we just made, our API call. So to-do lists, to the API, get task list by ID, but we need some ID here, right? So we need to figure that out. This is where we go to that promise.all. This is something we've seen in past challenges, but the task list that we have is going to have a bunch of task IDs in it. And there's other ways to solve this. Nested serializer will be one way, but I don't want to get too complicated with that. So I think we need to do a couple things here. Let's see, actually, I need to change the design. So we need a const load task list. So we need to get the task list first before we get the tasks for it. So this would be another API call. Let data equal to do API get get task list. Do I not have that? All right, so what do we have here? We have get all task lists. We have create, we get delete. We need to get a detail. So get task list by ID would be a get request. So we're going to use this, again, a get request to a particular task list ID. So I have a new function here.
Real quick, Ankur, on the get all task by ID, you're passing in ID instead of a task ID on the URL.
Right here.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, we're not going to use this right now, but yeah, that is a mistake. So here, I want to get the task list object, just one of them. So that's the detail view that we're doing on task list page. So ignore kind of what I did here. This can go away for now. Okay, but we have get all. We want to get task list by ID. What's the ID here? Anyone have an idea of how we can get the ID here? I know it's probably tough to follow after lunch. Seeing some tired faces. John, you're not giving me confident.
Is it use params?
Yes, Andrew's got it right. So backtracking, if you look at app.js, if you remember, this route has an ID that we can pick off from the URL. So that is coming from the use params hook. Good call there, Andrew. So we're going to need to import use params. Again, this is a router functionality from React router DOM. Then we want to get it here. Okay, and then we have params, so we should be able to do params.id because ID was the name that we gave it in our route. So we need to await this. We can get the task list. we need to set that in a state value. So let's do that up here. Okay, so initial value will be null because we don't have something, we have nothing. It's a single item, so task list. We get our data and then we set task list to data. Okay, so that's our load task list, which we want to do right here. And then we're going to change another use effect here. Actually, we can just do it all in one. So one idea was anytime that our task list changed, we could do another use effect to get the tasks. But I'm going to be lazy here and do that in this use effect or this load task list. So let's task data equal await. So we're going to have a for loop here. Oh, we have some hands raised. Andrew Tran, what's up?
I have a question about what's happening conceptually. So the params are getting passed through the front end. Then we're going to async await, and the to-do API is going to talk to our backend, and we're waiting for that data from our backend.
Yep.
Right. And then we're setting the data on our front end again.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, there's not an easy way for us to pass it to a task list page through the router. Because you're right. Like if you think about the homepage has access to all the task lists, it would be nice if we just pass it down as a prop to the task list page, but task list page doesn't exist here. So we're going to do it through params. Yep, we're going to fetch the task list ID. I'm seeing some confused faces on the Zoom, and I don't blame you. So please ask questions if I can help you understand anything better. I know it's been a little chaotic with adding all this code. We want to do for task ID of data dot tasks. All right, so this is basically, I'm kind of cheating here. I'm not doing another use effect, but if I were doing this the appropriate way, if you're gonna force me to, I'll do it. Use effects. The proper way would be to spy on task lists. So whenever task lists update, we want to get all the tasks for it. This is the appropriate way to do it. I guess I'll do it appropriately because I don't want to be a bad example. So we need to make sure that task list is not null, else we can't do this step. John Price.
Yeah, this is more kind of like geared toward something going on in my own code, but like for instance, you set your state initially to null.
Yep.
In my code, I'm incrementing my state, and so it's a number, so I have to initially set it to 0.
Okay.
But whenever the page refreshes, it then sets it back to 0 instead of continuing the incrementing.
What is the increment for?
It's like counting. It's for the rock paper scissors one. It's like counting the number of wins that each person got. So I tried running prevent default on all of the event handlers, and it's still refreshing.
Yeah, we're probably gonna need to talk about that offline.
Okay.
But it might be hard to diagnose right now. All right, so load tasks will be an async function. All right, so we're keeping track of the master task list and then all the child tasks that come back from the second call. So I'll walk through this code because there's a lot of wires that we gotta jump through. But if we don't have a task list, we set all the tasks to null or empty list. If we do have a task list, we should be able to do for loop. Sean, you have a question?
Since we're using task list on the homepage and this page, what if we had it, could we have it like in the app.js and pass it down? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that could work, but I guess we don't always have a task list though, right? If we're on the home page, there's no task list that's in question. It could work where you're managing it somewhere else. We haven't talked about use context in this course, but that's one way you can kind of manage data kind of across your application. So there might be other solutions to this, but again, we're doing it the API way. This is probably the typical way you'd expect it, as in you get an ID and you just need to fetch it from the back end in task list dot tasks. All right, so we need to do our promise all. So let's collect all of our promises. Let's do let's task promises. Oh, actually, we could await them since we are in async. So let's do all right, so we need to fetch each individual task by their ID. And we luckily have a method for it, which is to do API get task by ID, which we added, pass it a task ID. We're going to await that result and then push into our new tasks. And then finally, we'll call set tasks with the new tasks. Okay, so a lot going on here. Definitely want to make sure we go over it. So in our task list page, this is acting as our task list detail page. The first thing we do is we get an ID. So we should probably do params.id here. So anytime we navigate to this page, we're going to have a params.id. That ID refers to one particular task list that we want to show on this page. In order to show it, we need to get it from the back end because we only have the ID right now. We don't have any other details about the task list. So load task list will call our API using that ID, and we should get the full task list object. So they'll have the name, the description, all the child task IDs is completed, right? That was part of our serializer. So that's what we get back here. And we set that as our state value. So we are updating our state value here, which is asynchronous. This will happen at some point. Whenever React gets to updating our state value for task lists, that's going to trigger our second use effect. So now we're saying our task list got updated. We want to go ahead and fetch all the child tasks that were part of that. So now that task list has been updated, assuming it's not null, we should be able to go through each of the tasks. These are going to be IDs, keep in mind, because we send only IDs for the child items. We're going to go through, get each ID, and then call one by one the backend. Give me each task detail here. And then when we get all the task details, we're going to update our state value for tasks. And now we should be able to use that to render our tasks, which was the whole goal right here. So here we should be able to do return tasks.map task index return. Normally I want to create a component here, but just to kind of make it a little shorter, I'm going to return a paragraph that's going to be task.task. And we probably need an index. Okay, so now we're actually getting each task object. We're going to show the task. We can show more detail here too. Like if you want to show, I don't know, what else does the task have on a due date? We could show a due date. Task.due date. All right, a lot of code we added. I'm sure I made typos, but let's test this out, see how badly I broke it, and then we'll try to fix it. And then we need to get an authentication still. I probably should end this after this. All right, so let's go to 2020 goals, or let's go to weekend to-dos because we had a bunch of stuff there. All right, so that didn't work. We got an error. Jesse, you have a question?
Yeah, you said that I should put this over to components. Are you talking about just the render task const on line 42 down, or what did you mean by that?
Yeah, so right now I'm just showing a paragraph tag, but ideally I'd want this to be like a task summary component, similar to how we did on our homepage, where we render like a task list summary component that can do has more logic in it, right? Like this task list summary lets us delete the item. It also shows more detail. It kind of just abstracts some of the complexity away from the parent. So same thing I would do here. I'd create a new component that would show me like the due date and render the task and whatever else I want to do with the task instead of doing it all here.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I have some errors here. We have null for tasks on line 34. Questions, keep asking your questions as I go through here.
Ankur, I have a question. Could you look at line 18 real quick? What your params ID? So your use effect runs when you want this use effect to run when the page loads, right?
Yes.
So why did you use params ID instead of a empty thing?
Good question. So if this were empty, this would run exactly one time. If this is not empty, this is going to run the first time on initial render and anytime that ID changes. The key here, it's not working right now, but if I go up here and change this to 7, this page, this component doesn't reload. The component stays on the screen because React is like, all right, you're using the same component. I'm not going to delete it and recreate one. You have the component I need. We're just going to update the ID. So it's going to make another call to the backend to get the correct task list.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
My code is becoming spaghetti now, but this is kind of getting like a large project. I need to figure out why this is not working. So let's try to debug it. So again, line 34, tasks is null. That should never happen. So line 34, saying tasks.
On line 21, is it get task list by ID?
Yes, thank you so much. You guys are great. Yes, get task list by ID. All right, get another error, line 44. This is the process of debugging. So task will be an empty list initially. And then it should be empty list or this. All right, sorry, we're gonna go through some debugging, but we could figure it out. So tasks at 0, not found. All right, let's try to go to our API view. We want to go to API root tasks at 0. Detail not found. Oh, because everything's 1 based. So why am I going from 0? Anyone know why I have a 0 value? So task PT here. All right, so let's make sure we understand our data. So we go to task list. I'm getting this task list back for weekend to-dos. That has an ID here. So I should be fetching task with ID 1 if this is working correctly. So let's add some debugging statements. Let's see. All right, so we do have that task list correct here. That's our response data. So everything so far is correct. This is calling tasks of 0 for some reason. I know why. This has been in me before. That needs to be of, not in. In gets me the index, of gets me the object. I can't believe I fell for that again. There we go, now it's working. Finished doing my taxes, unfortunately, due on 18. So that is working. Again, we could do a lot more cutting here, but I think we're probably tired of cutting. I definitely am. Authentication is the next game in town. So the key challenge here is when I go to the homepage, let's go to, I guess we don't have users right now. The goal here is we can have different users for our site. Currently, we're fetching every single task list that got created, regardless if you, as in me or someone else created it. I get to see everyone's task list. That might be great for me, but it could be private information. So usually for sites like these, we should only serve up task lists that are tied to the current user, but that requires login functionality, which we do not have right now. All right, but we are due for a break and I do want to kind of talk to you guys. So let's stop the recording there.